Good evening, everybody. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I would like to warmly welcome you all to today's Hague Initiative for Law and Armed Conflict lecture on new technologies in modern warfare, in which we will be exploring the multifaceted relations between new technologies and contemporary armed conflicts. My name is Stavros Pantazopoulos, and I'm a researcher here at the HILAC Institute. Together with my dear colleague James Sexton, we received the baton from Christoph Paulussen, and we will be co-coordinating the HILAC Lecture series. The HILAC Lecture series is an occasional lecture series on the subject of law and armed conflict, organized by the T.M.C. Institute since 2005 in cooperation with the Netherlands Red Cross and the Amsterdam Center for International Law, and it is held at the premises of the Institute. The lecture today is co-organized with the International Humanitarian Law and Criminal Law Platform, which is an academic network in the field of international humanitarian law and international criminal law, established in 2010. And now allow me to introduce our two speakers, two esteemed colleagues with which I had the chance to work together in different contexts in the past. Our first speaker is Assistant Professor Rebecca Mignot-Mahdavi. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Rebecca could not join us in person, but the old technologies, if I may say so, allow us to welcome her online. Rebecca Mignot-Mahdavi is an Assistant Professor of International Law at SciencesPo Law School. Rebecca's current research is situated in the field of digital security law and global governance. Her research reflects on techno-legal modes of governance and their evolution, proliferation, in a context where new forms of transnational risk anticipation strategies, and technology are in play. Her monograph, Drones and International Law, a Techno-Legal Machinery, was published by Cambridge University Press in July 2023. Rebecca is an editor for the legal theory section of the Leiden Journal of International Law, a co-founder and coordinator of the EASIL Interest Group on International Law and Technology, and a board member of the Women in International Law Network. She's an associate researcher at the T.M.C. Institute and at the International Center for Counterterrorism. Our second speaker, sitting next to me, is Wim Zwijnenburg, a project leader on humanitarian disarmament for PAX, a Dutch peace organization. Wim has been working on drone use and proliferation since 2011 and published numerous reports on the development of drones use in conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Ukraine, and the African continent. He also coordinated the European Forum on Armed Drones and is working on advocacy towards building transparency and accountability around extrajudicial killings with armed drones. His work also focused in building international norms and standards around the growing use and proliferation of military and weaponized commercial drones through improved export controls. Our speakers today will help us disentangle some of the complexities surrounding the use of new technologies in modern armed conflicts. Rebecca will first offer her valuable insights on the ways new technologies on the battlefield, international law and military strategy have interacted and reshaped one another. And subsequently, Wim will reflect on the possibilities that new technologies open up for the documentation of wrongful conduct in war with uncrewed systems, focusing in particular on states using armed drones for targeted killings outside areas of armed conflicts, and the increased use and proliferation of weaponized commercial drones by non-state armed groups. Before yielding the floor to our speakers, I would like to kindly remind you that a Q&A session will follow their presentations. So I would also like to encourage our online participants to pose their questions in the chat. Rebecca and Wim, it is my immense pleasure to welcome you both at today's HILAC lecture, and I would now like to pass the screen to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stavro. Can you all hear me properly? I want to thank you very much, first of all, Stavro. It's particularly pleasurable and also an honor to be part of this HILAC lecture led by Dr. Pantazopoulos, whose work I I admire very much in the field of IHL, and also an immense pleasure to be sitting virtually next to Wim, whose path I've crossed as part of the European Forum on Armed Drones. Because I'm the first to start, I thought that I would want to put international law and technology scholarship related to the use of new technologies of warfare a little bit in context, to reflect on our role and postures as international lawyers. And I want to overall draw potential pathways for alternatives to what I would like to call futurism and solutionism in international law and security and technology. I have shared screen, but I can't see it at where I see my face. Hopefully you can see it in the room. Yes? Okay,
Yep.
great. Perfect. So what do I mean by futurism and solutionism that I think are pervasive in international law and technology scholarship? What we've noticed over the past decades is a prevalent view of time, especially of the future within international legal thought and practice, but in particular in international law and technology, as a realm not only of prediction, but also of action. And this is no surprise, right? It originates in the modern belief in the lawyer's ability to apply their principles and toolbox to comprehend the world in advance and address its challenges. And it gives rise, of course, to solutionist attitudes in the field, according to which lawyers, international lawyers, can be experts in world making, in world knowing. And this, of course, extends beyond the sole field of international law and technology, but it's particularly noticeable in this field, in my view. So to tell you a little bit about what I mean by this, we see that there is something specific in international law and technology scholarship where international lawyers have a tendency to identify the coming mysterious techno futures ahead and position themselves as experts, including in world futures and world making. And this exercise often consists in predicting these techno futures and simultaneously remaining in control by simultaneously demonstrating in advance a capacity to provide solutions for the foreseen situations in terms of technological innovation on the battlefield. So we see basically entire scholarly articles, entire books that revolve around this prediction exercise of the techno future and of and revolving around this solutionist attitude, demonstrating that there is a capacity to find in the toolbox of the lawyers a possibility to adapt to it way in advance. And this is, of course, not the sole type of scholarly endeavor that we see in the field. Some interventions are much more empirical and concrete. It's the case of Wim's work, for instance, and it's also the path that I try to draw in my scholarship. What is quite interesting to me is that there is something at stake in these futurist moves in international law and technology scholarship. And there is something at stake that deserves to be unpacked by looking closely at what I call here futurism. I would like to argue that futurism is not solely and not that much actually a way to successfully govern the challenges ahead that will emerge, but rather a technique to govern the present world. When looking, for instance, at the intervention of international lawyers who adopt such futuristic attitudes and their intervention in discussions around the future of military AI or related to emerging AI-enabled defense systems, for instance, we see that it's a world that is very much dominated by Western thinkers, but also by military lawyers and government lawyers who have been very keen on occupying this space. Certain scholars actually have, in other fields of the humanities, have highlighted how discussions regarding the regulation of emerging AI-enabled defense systems have gradually focused on a Western and modernist idea that you are all aware of meaningful human control. And this notion, these scholars argue, seeks to center the deployment of autonomous systems and other AI-enabled defense systems around a specific image of the meaningful human that reflect archetypes of, or that are associated with a Western, rational, white, male, at least such characteristics in these debates. So what is available to us if we suspend this solutionist and futuristic attitudes to international law and technology and to new technologies of warfare? What, in other words, is available to us if we suspend the desire to know the world in advance and change the world as lawyers? And this is in echo with a paper I co-authored with Eliana Cusato, Sofia Stolk, and Renske Vos that was just published in the Leiden Journal of International Law. So first of all, what suspending the desire to change the world does not mean is that it doesn't mean that we should neglect, of course, the world-making potential of international law. On the contrary, I believe that recognizing that international law shapes the world and world hegemonies and discourses is a precondition to modestly realize that our role as international legal scholars cannot be exclusively construed as a world-changing and world-fixing mission. In other words, if we register the world-shaping effects of international law is, of course, a precondition to suspend this desire to change the world and try to do something else. So what does it look like in the field of international law and technology? What I suggest we ought to do for starters is to look at how international law and technology interact with and reshape one another, and how these techno-legal machineries affect bodies, behaviors, societies, and the international legal order as a whole. This is what I've tried to do in my work so far. That was also the purpose of the book that Stavros kindly mentioned, where I look in a more social legal way at how new technologies, or actually actual current technologies of warfare, in that case those that are part of what I call a drone program, lead to the emergence of a war paradigm as a way to anticipate hostile threats rather than respond to actual material acts of violence. So the outcome of this anticipation paradigm, in other words, I show, leads to a kind of individualization and dematerialization of war. I can go back to these concepts in the Q&A later, but the idea is quite simple. In fact, it's the idea that when it's geared towards anticipation, warfare becomes an exercise of trying to identify suspicious behaviors of individuals based on elements that are different from the witnessed participation of hostilities of these individuals. And this is oftentimes accompanied by very sophisticated and this is not to say that they are not contestable, but very sophisticated legal rationals, legal narratives, both in the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello paradigm. And here we see that technology plays an important role in this network of actors, in both facilitating this new kind of warfare that is organized around the objective to anticipate threats rather than respond to acts of violence, but also somehow makes these new, very extensive interpretations of international legal norms sound or appear more acceptable. In other words, were it not for the technological capacities of drones in that case, I argue that the legal narratives that, for example, if we are in the realm of the jus ad bellum and look at the extensive interpretation of the right of self-defense that was proposed by the Obama administration and followed by different allies, or if we are in the realm of the jus in bello, looking at the understanding of direct participation in hostilities as continuous combat function, and we can unpack this together later, were it not for the technological capacities of drones, these new interpretations would have survived in a much more difficult manner, or probably not survived in the space of international legal discourse. What I further am interested in is how these new technologies or current technologies of warfare, so drones in that case, but we can have also a discussion about AI-enabled defense systems, including those that we see are currently used in Gaza, and also revolve around the idea that threats should be anticipated and that open the scope of warfare beyond actual moments of hostilities. I'm interested in understanding how these new technologies create or stabilize some sort of institution or institutional apparatus that is accompanied, and this is where I look further at the network, accompanied by these sophisticated legal rationals that I've briefly mentioned earlier. This creative and stabilizing force of technology and the law together lead or have led to the emergence, in the case of drone programs, to very concrete traces of a stable bureaucracy and institution. And this is, of course, the outcome or the peak of the demonstration, is to try and understand what this kind of everywhere and infinite warfare in time and space, once it's institutionalized, including because the anticipative paradigm allow for such an institutionalization and infinity, the question remains of what it creates, how it impacts bodies, behaviors, societies, and international legal order as a whole. And I talk in the book about rituals of sovereignty and the extension, basically, of state sovereignty, the operating state sovereignty over individuals living under drones, thanks to the work that has been done by different NGOs, civil society networks, think tanks, etc., that document how societies living under drones have altered their traditions, their habits, their routines in a way that that demonstrates or that allows to argue for an extension of state power. I don't know exactly if I have time, but one thing that I wanted to share with you and that we can discuss in the Q&A, if you want this account to be a little bit more concrete and doctrinal, is an example of one of such techno-legal encounters. And I was referring to DPH, understood as a continuous combat function. I am happy to discuss further how existing norms together, or existing norms and together with the strategy and the discourse that aims to stabilize and justify new practices and new technologies of warfare, align with such strategies, techniques, and practices. I'm happy to talk further about the continuous combat function test that, in my view, broadly corresponds to signature strikes and to how signature strikes put civilians at great risk. Ultimately, when we conduct such an analysis of how continuous combat function as currently defined aligns with signature strikes, of course, propositions can be reformulated to rethink such a concept. I'm happy also to discuss this further, but what I want to end with is the idea that my initial call that in international law and technology scholarship, there is a need to suspend this solutionist move and this desire to change and fix the world in advance of the emergence of the challenges that are or will be posed by new technologies of warfare. Despite this call and the humility that it comes with, there is still a transformative potential of international law and technology scholarship actually being a transformative exercise, starting with the mapping of how international law, technology, and military strategy interact with and reshape one another, starting with this rather descriptive actor network theory-like account, doesn't preclude from making an intervention that potentially holds more transformative potential once the impact of such technologies on bodies, behaviors, societies, and the international legal order as a whole has been demonstrated. Many thanks for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this very thoughtful account. And I also liked the call in the end, which invites us to reflect on our own practices as well. I hope this will be picked up in the Q&A session. And now I would like to move on to our second speaker, Wim. So with no further ado, Wim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stavros, and thanks everyone for attending today, and also thanks for T.M.C. to give a lecture on this important and timely subject. Because for me also personally, it was a good opportunity to zoom out a little bit, as our work over the last 12 years have been mainly coming from sort of a technical and advocacy track, or an advocacy side, like tracking drone use in conflict zones and also engaging in discussions around arms export. So this lecture sort of forced me to reflect on these trends that we've seen in the past year. So normally I would use PowerPoint for these kind of presentations and show images and slides, but I thought this time it was good to sort of sit back and really think about like some kind of sort of reflections on where we are, where we are today, and sort of share those kind of thoughts with you in this sort of lecture, I guess. I'm not an academic. I'm working from a more practical point of view. So, and thanks again also Rebecca for these really critical reflections on this particular subject, because I think it resonates a lot with what we've come across. And so the title of today's event was New Technologies in Modern Warfare, and it warrants some of the sections of what will be of guidance of this discussion today on the development around drone warfare. So what is new about these technologies and what is actually modern warfare? I think it also requires some scrutiny to understand where we are, and also when it comes to the overwhelming use of remote lethal force through battlefields, so-called counter-terrorism operations, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, proxy wars, and even used by criminal groups, all with the use of drones in various shapes and sizes. I will not be addressing specifically the role of artificial intelligence in these developments, because there are already trends and patterns in the current and near horizon around the use of remotely human-controlled drone warfare. I think we need that are in need of discussion before moving forward on future risk. Plus, there is also already a lot of discussion on that going on. And I feel like we often move ahead to that discussion. We're now sort of reflecting on where we are with the current use of drones, or what this actually means. And I understand there's much more sort of sexiness towards artificial intelligence in the discussion, but I think it's also good to stop and reflect on where we are now before we jump into future developments. So as a peace organization, back in 2010, we were asked to reflect for the Dutch Ministry of Defense on future outlook of the armed forces to look at what the role of drones in warfare could be and the relevance to peace and security. The report we wrote, which was a slight mistranslation in English, does unmanned make unloved. It translated from the Dutch onbemand maakt onbemind, which is a wordplay on onbekend maakt onbemind, which means things we don't like the things we don't know. And back then, there weren't a lot of wasn't a lot of work done on what drones, how drones were being used. And the idea behind the title, though perhaps a silly pun, still hold meanings today because we fear what we don't know. And in 2010, the use of drones was still shrouded in secrecy, with glimpses of their increasing use in clandestine target killing operations by the US, and only I think a few back in 2011, 2010, there was the first report launched by in US university, by Stanford University, together with Reprieve on the drone strikes in Waziristan. But outside of that, we only recently learned that that the US and also recently, yeah, they mentioned Israel was already using drones back then, but we only recently learned that through new publications. It was mostly used outside of areas of armed conflict. But I think this soon changed also with the research coming out of Pakistan, which I just mentioned, Yemen and Somalia, that also showed that the death toll for civilians and the unwillingness by the US to provide a clear legal framework for these extrajudicial killings and the redress for civilian casualties really put this more on the agenda. Another element we addressed in that report, which still holds true today in today's debate, was also inspired by the late Professor Christoph Kuker, who sadly passed away a few months ago. I think his book Humane Warfare was an element of precognition about future warfare, as he already understood how risk averseness would drive the means and methods of warfare. The power, and with it also the projection of precision warfare, provided also us with the illusion of a risk-free, humane type of killing. Some academics even call this a moral type of killing, as they argued that armies had obligation to minimize the risk to their own troops, lest they forget that precision is largely dependent on the targeting data and the intention of those pushing the button. The examples of faulty intelligence leading to civilian deaths are numerous and are mentioned in examples from conflicts I mentioned earlier. But beyond that, there's also the intention that all users of drones are driven by liberal principles around protection of civilians and upholding legal principles. And even those who claim they are, such as the US, France, Israel, and the United Kingdom, have massively used drones under unacceptable justification that risk undermining existing legal frameworks aimed to protect civilians in and outside of conflicts. And the last element in this, in what we addressed in this report, was also how smaller, cheaper, and swarming drones would be an element of concerns in future warfare that soon proved to be a realistic threat. Now, fast forward to the world today, where drones have become a key element of any military and armed group that's currently involved in armed conflict, be it international or internal. Very little of the current drone technologies being used is new, and the type of conflict has hardly changed with where we were 12 years ago. The utility is also clear why armed forces are using them, considering their ability to improve situational awareness on the battlefield and their ability to use precision munitions. So these considerations are understandable and legitimate and not necessarily an issue for discussion today. What did change, however, is the scale, intensity, and targets of drone warfare that is foreboding a direction of the use of lethal force that needs to be strongly disputed, and where the international community needs to develop a clear mechanism that is able to prevent and minimize these impacts. I also want to reflect on these key elements for actions here today. Since the The forced transparency over the use of massive killing campaign that the CIA was conducting in its so-called war on terror, the UN special rapporteurs, human rights organizations, affected communities, drone operators and victims have all been very outspoken on how the use of such lethal force is undermining legal principles around the use of lethal force, how this has undermined trust in authorities and caused a massive psychological fear among those communities. But also, of course, each conflict has a unique perspective as well. The intensity of strikes and continuous presence of drones overhead caused fear in communities in Pakistan. It's not even people on the ground who are necessarily opposing this. From our partners in Yemen, we heard that people often had little issue with the targeting of Al-Qaeda, considering that threat proposed to local communities. The problem was often the wrong people were targeted and killed, and nobody was held accountable. The deafening silence from the international community to stand up against these practices didn't go also unnoticed among states who saw the utility of drone warfare to deal with insurgent groups in their own country or in areas bordering their countries. Take, for example, Turkey's fight against the PKK. That has been ongoing since the 1980s, with the PKK largely operating from difficult-to-reach mountains in Iraqi Kurdistan. Several Turkish military campaigns have tried to impact operability, often with little success and with high cost to their own troops. And to curb reliance on NATO partners for signal intelligence, often with the use of drones, Turkey started to successfully invest in their own drone industry and is now the largest exporter of drones worldwide. The presence of drones over northern Iraq and northern Syria, where the PKK is also operating, has now resulted in Turkey having taken over the role of the US as running the largest drone targeted execution campaign today. Already in 2023, it carried out 145 drone strikes against the actually US-supported Kurdish YPG forces, which Turkey accused of being a PKK-linked terror organization. The same YPG also spearheaded the fight against ISIS. Though there are clear collaborations between the YPG and the PKK, this on itself does not justify the extrajudicial killing campaign in northeast Syria. Turkey has not provided any details on the legal positions for the target killings outside of the area of armed conflict, why these people have been targeted, and how they pose an imminent threat to Turkish security. Many of those kills, we know from research done on the ground, are young foot soldiers, often ideologists, and otherwise not seemingly very relevant targets. And there also have been documented incidents of civilian casualties. At the same time, Turkey also used drones to target civilian infrastructure in northeast Syria, such as power plants and oil refineries that have impacted the humanitarian situation, such as access to energy for heating, that has limited water supplies, as pumping systems are not functioning. But the underlying point is that the cross-border operations would not have been possible without the enabling technologies that armed drones have become for militaries around the world. Another disturbing example is actually something I was working on today, is the use of armed drones in Nigeria. Last week we had a horrible drone attack that killed over 85 civilians in central Nigeria. Muslims were gathering to celebrate a religious event when a drone fired a missile at them. And after the first explosion, those who came to the rescue were struck by another missile again. And what turned out today with some new evidence we've been working on, this was again likely a Turkish drone strikes, which a Turkish drone was involved with the Nigerian armed forces were operating. Again, this is interesting because those drones are praised for their high precision, their accuracy, and their ability to have, with their camera sensors, to track and trace people and make a distinction between civilian and armed combatants. But again, apparently this was missed again today. Nigeria was also one of the first African states that used armed drones in many internal and cross-border conflicts. In the fight against Boko Haram in the north, insurgency in Niger Delta, pastoralist herder conflicts, violence, and separatists in the southeast. So again, drones, the vastness of this country and the growing security spurred by the use of drones, spurred the use of drones for the initial surveillance, but more increasingly also for law enforcement and operations and counterterrorism operations using lethal explosive force. And that comes with the price civilians are paying. And it's also a worrying trend that is enabled by the use of drones, again, through their unique capabilities. And I come back to that later when we see around the use of explosive force in law enforcement operations and how this is facilitated by this technology. But beyond Nigeria, we also see the increase of drones in Ethiopia, Somalia, Morocco, Niger, Burkina Faso, Togo, Mali, Algeria, and cross-border operations and internal conflicts. And it's also a sign on the wall how states are becoming more reliant on remote violence and as an accepted instrument for law enforcement. And that's why many of us in the disarmament and human rights communities were warning about, back from 2014 onwards, the lack of the international community responding to the US expanding use of drones for targeted killings. We demanded that this needed to be challenged, but to no avail. In 2016, actually, we held a meeting here in T.M.C, which renowned legal experts from academia, armed forces, human rights organizations, and UN representatives. The responses from states here were lukewarm and even dismissive. They saw little harm in and justified US practice on the basis of necessity against those threats from global terrorist groups. In the UN Special Rapporteur pleads to states to provide a legal position on IHL and IHRL around contested interpretations on the use of force fell on deaf ears. But we need also to go beyond another round of legal talk shops on the legality of this use, as the rules are clear and action is needed. The result of inaction is what we're witnessing today, an ever-expanding use of lethal force with military drones with limited transparency, accountability, and oversight worldwide. Next element I want to look at today is what also mentioned is the scrutiny on the implications of the rapid spread of commercial drones and drone technologies, as this has been rapidly also changing battlefields. This started with the so-called Islamic State, who actually drove the weaponization of commercial drones, turning them into a sort of poor man's air force. And soon the skies over Iraq and Syria were saturated with small quadcopters dropping explosives. And other armed groups are also quickly to use these kind of techniques. And the peak of this war fighting is what we're witnessing today in Ukraine, where both Ukrainian armed forces and Russia have perfected this type of warfare with drones. We're talking literally about tens of thousands of small drones that are used and hundreds of thousands that are in production. These drones are cheap, easy to produce, easy to use, difficult to spot, and nearly impossible to intercept, while being highly effective against a wide range of targets. This is even an argument to make that these type of drones will be defining future battlefields and not, as we mentioned earlier, the sophisticated, long-range, expensive military drones. In the same vein, we also see how commercial technologies have been driving the production of long-range, cheap kamikaze drones. In particular, Iran has been at the forefront of investing in this type of attack drones, sharing complete drones, relevant technologies, parts and components and designs with their proxy groups in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Gaza, and allied states such as Russia. Though cheap and relatively easy to shoot down, as we're seeing in Iraq and Ukraine, they have been effective in diverting resources for anti-air defenses, and at times have also been successful, such as strikes against targets in Saudi Arabia, including oil refineries. But also armed groups are in northwest Syria have been recently carrying out a range of successful strikes against regime's targets, but also killing civilians as well, as we saw a few months ago with a strike on the Homs military academy. We look at the types of drones developed there, they're quietly sort of DIY type of drones, but there's clearly design and improvement of design around these long-range drones. Again, I'm not deliberately not addressing how AI is going to speed up the effectiveness of these swarms for drone attacks and how they could be driving targeting decisions. It's outside the scope of my talk, but it's a gray area already developing where we're witnessing where drones are the building blocks for this type of the developments. I think by assembling military-grade and long-range suicide drones with widely available parts and components, states and armed groups also have the ability to carry out precision strikes with low efforts, a certain grade of deniability in large volumes, and potentially effective depending on the kind of air defenses you have in place. It also explains why likely most target of those drones have been civilian in nature if you look at the places where they're used. This also means an expected lower protection and is foreboding also further kind of strikes in this kind of nature. The civilian drone industry in this year or last year was estimated to be $11 billion net worth, and it's likely to become $48 billion by 2033. So we see more use of these kind of uncrewed technologies throughout society, which will also bring the question around privacy, flight safety, but also national security concerns. And the reason why I'm investing so much time in giving these examples to sketch out the situation today is also because there are certain predictive elements on the practice that warrants a rapid, strong, and joint response from the international community. And I'll give three key points to wrap up. Drones are an enabling technology, as Rebecca mentioned as well, when it comes to the lowering threshold for the use of force, lethal force. The combination of zero risk, long endurance, and precision weaponry have paved the way of expansion around the deployment, both with a widening geographical scope and in a way that other weapon platforms would not see. For example, the use of explosive weapons as a means of law enforcement we are seeing in Nigeria today is new or is expanding. But also the past examples of CIA operations are also the same example of that. In no circumstance would the US put their troops in harm's way with it, to conduct illegal strikes with ground operations or crewed aircraft over Pakistan. Drones may then do that. A similar point is made for the Turkish drone use in northeast Syria. Turkey would not go at length to take out all the suspected militants in northeast Syria without drones. The observation here is that technology is reshaping military tactics, strategy, and risk calculations. It's not also unique, what I'm saying, or anything groundbreaking. However, the refusal by states and their experts in armed forces to acknowledge this when it comes to the drones does demonstrate either an unwillingness to adapt to this reality or a very conservative view that has serious security implications. There are also and with security implications, I also mean this on the policy level. Same parallels are to be made with the current war in Gaza. The West for decades has worked to strengthen principles around the protection of civilians in war and holding countries accountable when they violated this. However, yet this all doesn't seem to matter anymore when it concerns one of our allies who is breaking all those rules and remain publicly silent on this. Both a lack of understanding or recognition how technologies are likely to reshape our thinking over the use of force and its application in tactics and strategy, and extension also of responsibilities and accountability, combined with an unwillingness to address this in a multilateral context, is posing risk to peace and security. States seem to be very wary of being restrictive, either out of fear towards their allies' position or out of fear to limit their own use in future battlefields or operations. The next reflection related to the rapid proliferation of drone technologies is throughout our whole society. The many gray areas between military and civilian drones provides a unique operating space for states and non-state armed groups to navigate and utilize to circumvent existing arms and dual-use technology export control regimes. The current mechanisms aimed to prevent unwanted end users obtaining military and dual-use technologies are often outdated, use fixed definitions, are limited in participations, or are remnants of post-Cold War views on arms export. To address this, a complete new way of looking at emerging technologies and the risk of peace and security is needed. One that balances out the civilian nature of many of them and the need for a free trade, while also recognizing the potential misuse for ending up in the wrong hands. And lastly, on a more philosophical reflection on the role of new technologies in warfare, I want to share a quote which I just lifted from a recent paper by Elke Schwartz, an academic who's doing groundbreaking research on the topics of drones and automated killings. And in it, she quotes her in an exchange between one of the pilots who dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, Claude Etherly. And he's struggling with the morality of the bombing, and is having this letter exchange with the German philosopher Gunther Anders. And in their letter, they discuss their feelings around the morality and the oral act thereof and the new ways of killing. And he writes that the fact that today it is possible that unknowingly and indirectly, like screws in a machine, we can be used in actions, the efforts of which are beyond the horizon of our eyes and imagination, and of which, could we imagine them, we could not approve. This fact has changed the very foundations of our moral existence. Though this discussion was mainly between him and the German philosopher about nuclear weapons, these considerations also hold true for the remote controlled and soon also artificially controlled use of lethal force. I do fear that the trend of how the general risk awareness and limited interest in the military in Western society and the absence of the willingness to send our own troops in harm's way will further drive the increase of use of drones, not only in warfare, but also in law enforcement and policing operations. The spillover into domestic security policies already happening, with drones able to launch tear gas and stun grenades and equipped with tasers. So is there hope on the horizon? There have been past initiatives and suggestions that are of guidance where political movement is possible. The UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in 2050 laid out various options for the UN to take the lead on, ranging from a group of governmental experts to even a form of convention debate outside of the UN, if no consensus can be reached. In 2016, the US launched its joint declaration on the use of and export of armed UAVs, signed off by 53 states. There was a follow-up process that should lead to a political binding international norms on the use of export of drones, but has been stalled since Trump took office and the current status is unknown. In 2017, the European Parliament drafted its common position on the use of armed drones, yet again with little support to follow up that was expressed in the EU. However, this year during the UN General Assembly, Portugal indicated it's willing to submit a resolution that will ask the UN to start a process to taking stock of these developments and explore what multilateral avenues would be most effective in curbing the risk of military UAVs. Beyond this political process, the work done by the legal community, academics, practitioners, and remains vitally important to keep pressure on these international debates around the emerging technologies that are shaping warfare. And I hope today's meeting and discussion can be of inspiration for further exploration and inspire to continue to work on this topic. And looking forward to the debate and the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wim, for your thought-provoking account. Like Rebecca's, we see again this the concept, this problematic concept perhaps, or the issue with the binaries, the fluidity between warfare and law enforcement activities, the hybridization between the public and the private sector, commercial and military drones, dual use objects when you're at the receiving end. And I think you fleshed out all these complexities. And of course, again, at the end, we had a call or a reflection on the role of experts and the lawyers, and I think we should take this up. We can now move, I think, to the Q&A session. For people attending here in person, you can raise your hand, and of course we will come to you with the microphone. Please introduce yourselves before posing the question. And of course, we will also have a look at the chat online to check whether our online participants have posed any questions in chat. So I would like now to invite you to participate in the Q&A session. Please raise your hands and pose any question you want to any or to both speakers. And of course, we have a look at the chat as well. Yes.
My name is Jan Pieck. I'm just an interested pensioner. I have some questions. Wim Zwijnenburg already mentioned that low-cost drones will severely alter the whole scene because there will be many and they will be lethal. These will also be used by non-state actors like liberation movements, terrorist groups, other dissatisfied militias, stuff like that. That makes the prospect of international law curbing this rather dim. Do you agree with that?
Thank you so much. If we don't have another immediate, I think we can take this up.
Yeah, sure. So in general, armed groups or criminals don't necessarily follow the law by nature, but by practice. But what we can do is to curb their access to these kind of technologies to facilitate their use. In that case, prevent them from having access to these technologies. And that's going to be difficult. And that's also what I try to lay out, because the civilian use is like in the Netherlands alone, I think there's between 1,800,000 drones that are flown by private citizens or by companies. But when it comes to export, there are now discussions, can we limit, for example, if there's a suppose you have a terrorist group or an armed group in country X, and there is an import order coming to a company in a drone producing country for commercial drones, and they see like, okay, there's 1,000 drones going to this country Y, which is on the border. So you can do a risk assessment and you can see if there's a risk for circumvention of the word I was looking for, but there's a risk of diversion going to the next door country because you know a group is active there and have an interest in it. So you can have a kind of restriction to make sure that these commercial drones that are exported to country Y don't end up in country X. So those kind of things are possible to put in place. But there are of course, because of the nature of it, it's going to be difficult. So there's one point you can either invest more in defenses against those kind of drones, which still is difficult today. And yeah, those are the options that we have. But yeah, it comes to export control of those kind of technologies and engaging with industry and engagement with different control regimes. That's the only thing I think we can do when it comes to those kind of uses.
Then we will have the follow-up question.
Hello, my name is Marwan. I have a first question for Rebecca and second one for Wijn. So my question for Rebecca is, you mentioned anticipation hostility within the concept of drone warfare and modern warfare in general. So I wanted to just ask if wouldn't that technically, in a way, be sort of a good thing if two, say, like superpowers, let's say the Cold War, for example, they did anticipate each other's hostility. So, and this is why nobody really wanted to attack the other first, because they know it's mutually assured destruction. So wouldn't you agree with me that this might be like one good outcome in a way? And the second part of the question as well is, she mentioned how Gaza was an example of institutionalized warfare. So for one, I wanted to know what you mean by institutionalized. And second, wouldn't Gaza be sort of an example of, I would say, democratization of warfare? Because as you see, you have more of like a loose militant group versus a strong army. So what I've noticed during that is that Hamas, they have been using drones and guerrilla tactics and other cheap weapons as a way to face off against a much larger and more technologically advanced military. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, have you heard the question? Was it?
Yeah, I think I got it almost fully. So thanks a lot for these two very important questions. First, your initial question / remark is of course a very important one, because the military has always been seeking to achieve to reach the utmost level of anticipation of threats. So this is nothing new. It's almost a continuity. However, new technologies of warfare, drones, but also AI-enabled defense systems, kind of exacerbate this thirst for anticipation. But more importantly, many states that Wim and I have been critical of in our accounts have overestimated what the technology can do and the precision with which it allows to predict actual threats. So this objective of prediction is nothing new. You're right. It's also something that could be, in principle, desirable to achieve, but there is an overestimation of what the technology can do for you. And this is something that I can expand on, taking the example that I mentioned of the Gospel AI system, the Hapsora Gospel, which was documented and investigated by Plus 972 and local call that are now, so the investigation is now taken and referred to by numerous mainstream media. So it's an AI system and program that has been deployed following the Hamas-led attack on Israelis or South Israel on the 7th of October, the dramatic attack, of course. After the launch of this attack, the response by Israel as part of this AI system that was documented thanks to discussions that these two media had with 7 present and former members of Israel's intelligence community, as well as Air Force personnel, military intelligence broadly, corroborated by Palestinian testimonies, data, documentation from Gaza, and official statements from the IDF spokesperson and other Israeli state institution. It has shown how, I was mentioning rather, how it was exemplifying, illustrating the turn to anticipatory warfare. So the idea that these AI-enabled defense systems allow to detect threats outside moments of active hostilities. So just a quick recap, if I can, if we have time. Traditionally, international humanitarian law, through the notion of direct participation in hostilities, requires that someone who is part of a non-state armed group be targeted only and for such time as the person directly participates in hostilities. So as long and for such time as this person is seen, is witnessed as causing harm to the detriment of the other party. In 2009, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, crystallized the notion of direct participation in hostilities as continuous combat function. This notion of continuous combat function opened the moment and the possibility for targeting beyond sole moments of active hostilities when an individual is identified based not on witnessed participation in hostilities, but on other circumstantial evidence, when this individual is understood to have a lasting integration into a non-state armed group. So here, bear in mind that the ICRC demands that lasting integration is evidenced. So it does put a sufficiently high threshold, but because this CCF category, this continuous combat function, doesn't require, it actually even says, the ICRC interpretive guidance even says that someone can be understood as holding a continuous combat function even before he or she carries a hostile act. So this gave space for signature strikes or anticipatory targeting to take place, in my view, which is weird, huh? It's illogical if you think about it. You lower the threshold for targeting, you don't need to witness direct participation in hostilities, and you broaden the scope of opportunities for targeting. So there is even there is a paradox in this shift and this move to the continuous combat function. Well, we see, if we compare the current operations that followed the Hamas-led attacks on southern Israel on October 7, when we compare it to former operations by Israel in the Palestinian occupied territories, we see that a number of targeting practices encompasses private homes, public buildings, infrastructures, tool buildings where suspicious behaviors have been noticed. So it's not just the traditional rationale that there is one known member of Hamas that justifies or would justify potentially collateral damage. Here, as part of Habsora, the gospel, which is largely built again on artificial intelligence, the idea is that without knowing the identity of the individuals based on circumstantial evidence other than witnessed direct participation in hostilities, individuals, and this is a zero-risk strategy that you can understand poses great risk to the civilian population and can be characterized or will be characterized under international criminal legal lens or lenses as at least war crimes, crimes against humanities, and potentially crime of genocide, depending on the evidence that is gathered. Here we see how there is a turn to anticipation that is not just the classic understanding as part of the military that there should be a military advantage gained by technical means to gain this capacity to anticipate. Here it's the idea of zero risk. As soon as there's one resident that is understood as potentially being part of Hamas based on criteria that we are unaware of, and that are not, certainly not witness direct participation in hostilities, then the individual is considered potentially as holding a continuous combat function and the target or the strike is conducted. So this is a bit of a long answer to your two very important questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Would you like to pose the follow-up question? Yes. On this one? Okay, and then we'll go back. Let's.
If you look at gospel, the numbers targeted before in Israeli operations on Gaza, when it was done manually, it was about 50 per day, as I read on Twitter, and now it has gone up to 1,500 per day. And all international reporters mention the devastation on a truly gigantic scale. Gaza has just been flattened, the home of more than 2 million people. And there are also now, and I think this ties into the gospel as well, there are also mentions of Israel taking out all Gaza lawyers, human rights workers, academics, stuff like that. So they're also decapitating Gaza intellectually, all enabled by this AI, because Israel doesn't give a shit about international law. So I don't know if you wish to comment on that.
Sounded like a remark, but Rebecca, if you want to reflect on this.
I take it as a follow-up to my remark in the continuity thereof.
Thank you. And then we can move on back.
My name is Ivan, and full disclosure, I'm a reserve officer in the Danish military. So I may have that lens on it as well. Just to pick up on a few points, but also, of course, to thank Rebecca and Wim for the very good and interesting presentations. But as the previous speaker said, also looking at some of the advantages in having a paradigm of anticipation. So just to illustrate just how not new it is, and you said it, Rebecca, yourself, it's not a new thinking, of course, among militaries, the importance of anticipation. Sun Tzu, 500 BC, had the famous phrase, know your enemy, emphasizing the importance of good intelligence, but also this famous quote that if you are the first on the battlefield, you arrive fresh. If you are late, you arrive exhausted. So of course, it is an underlying current. Concretely to some of the points you raised, to me, it seems that some of the critique about the futurism and solutionism of the current mindset is also a broader critique of realism and positivist thinking. But the counter argument to that is, of course, that if you live in a world where some state actors are very realist and don't care too much about international human rights law or even human rights, then we are in this classical mindset that, yes, maybe you are open to adopt other ways of thinking about the use of militaries and of military technology. But if the adversaries are not, then you're still caught in this prisoner's dilemma. And it would be interesting to hear some of your thoughts about that. And maybe also a comment or a question to some of the points you raised, Wim, about how drones, how they also affect the military thinking and the tactics. Of course they do. I think all weaponry throughout time has always not had that effect in a way. So I don't think substantively there's something new about it. My suggestion would be that if, as international human rights scholars, you want to influence and have a positive and humane influence on the use of weaponries, then the jurisprudence, for example, is one way to go. So we need to start speaking with the judges at the Hague-based institutions who will start hearing cases about the use of drones and other technologies. And just like it was done at the ICTY cases, where artillery, there were discussions about how close can you fire into a city before it is criminal offense or not to come close to civilian targets. The same type of discussion would then need to take place about drone use of drones. Sorry, I took a little bit of a long time, but I wanted to throw those thoughts in there.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, would you like to go first and then Wim?
Yes, sure. Although I spoke a lot already, so if Wim wants to start, then I will follow with my comments. Whatever you prefer. You're the lead, Stavros. I cannot hear you anymore.
I see that Wim is keeping some notes, so perhaps
Okay,
you can
perfect.
first.
Yeah, sure. So this is an incredibly important remark, of course, and there's so I fully agree with your account. I take it as an opportunity to highlight the fact that in your position and in the environment you evolve in, futurism is an actually very presentist move, because you're the one who has the most accurate knowledge of AI-enabled defense systems that are under development, either where you're looking at or with different partners. So in that case, I think that my remark wouldn't apply, and that even for scholars who have the opportunity to interact with people who are in charge of developing and deploying potentially such systems, I think that there is a real concreteness and rootedness in engaging in futuristic thinking, which then is much less futuristic in the end. So, and one thing I would like to add is that this is actually, in this type of realm, it's absolutely crucial to think or imagine how legal evaluation should look like, depending on the type of AI-enabled defense system that is being developed, that differs from our traditional understanding of legal evaluation. So maybe I will leave it to this, but my account or my criticism was really formulated to legal scholarship, international legal scholarship, that really starts fantasizing or imagining scenarios that are sometimes very remote from practitioners' view and practice of what is being what is being currently developed.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think also what I tried to underscore in the presentation, indeed, that it's nothing new about that military is adapting new types of weapons. And I think what I try to underscore is that weapons do change military types of interventions. And that we see this kind of new type of interventions, like all these cross-border operations, with the US as an example, but like there are a plethora of examples at the moment in Africa and in the Middle East as well, with these kind of cross-border operations that are facilitated by these kind of technologies under disputed legal terms. I think that's where we need to push back on, because I think that's the problematic part of how technologies are shaping warfare, in that sense that the operations are now conducted often in areas with they are difficult to reach. So like Western Sahara areas in Niger, even southern Turkey, northern Iraq, and Syria. Northeast Syria is more easier to document those kind of strikes. But like yesterday, Human Rights Watch put out a report on those killings in Nigeria. Where in this case, the Nigerian armed forces admitted they made a mistake. But often it's very difficult for us to check what's happening in those remote areas. And I think that kind of use is facilitated by this technology. And our concern is like we see an expansion of this kind of cross-border operation because of the risk that is clearly driven by the technology itself. And it's really concernable that states are using these kind of interpretations that also Rebecca outlined in her presentation, and it's not being pushed back again. And again, that's where the responsibility is for states to clearly underscore the current existing legal interpretation of those kind of concepts. Otherwise, other states start using. Or we see like the expansion of use of extrajudicial killings with drones, but also beyond that. And it makes it very difficult to speak out against misuse. And there might be justifications in some cases where there's a risk or there's a direct threat from groups, as we see, for example, the US is now doing in Iraq, where they target militant groups that are attacking their bases, and they use these kind of justifications to immediately strike those kind of groups which are setting like missile positions or drone launches. The real problem is like, with a growing, I think the trend is we see more like state, non-state actor kind of fighting, where drones are used as a sort of quick solution, but there's no thinking around like the long-term strategy. And even though with drones, like for example the use in Pakistan, but also how Turkey is using it, in the end it's containment politics. They are effective in that sense. They're forcing armed groups underground. It's limiting movement of political leaders or military leaders of those kind of groups. But it doesn't provide a solution to the larger problem in many of those kind of conflicts where for states and non-state actors. So it's really more sort of a tactical solution for a problem, but there's hardly any focus on, okay, how we're going to resolve the conflict. Because like, I don't think we're going to resolve the conflict between Turkey and the PKK by Turkey just killing everyone who's slightly associated with the PKK, whatever you think of the group. But I think continuous killing doesn't going to make a solution, and it continues to pose risk to civilians and infrastructure. And the same for Al Qaeda in Pakistan. Like they still remain a threat either in Pakistan or even in Afghanistan. So yeah, there remains like all these kind of questions open over justification of the remote force with drones and hardly any sort of more over the horizon thinking for solutions. I think that's something we continue to keep to push for.
Thanks so much, Wim. More questions? Yeah, let's go first over there.
Thank you. Yeah, Henning Lahmann, Leiden University. Thanks to Wim and Rebecca for these really excellent presentations. I have a question to Rebecca, and I know we've addressed this question maybe before, but just connecting this to your talk, how much is IHL in this context like an adequate framework even to discuss these questions, and how much does it maybe exacerbate the problem by like providing a framework of thinking about these issues that legitimizes to some extent at least, these practices by states and maybe makes the problem worse? And if you also think that, then what will be the alternative? That will be my question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Henning, and thanks for the great question. Of course, you've spotted right that the main account that I'm making when looking at these techno-legal apparatuses is one where the law emerges, and IHL in particular here emerges as having a function of stabilizing and legitimizing problematic practices. But it's also an account that I think is a necessary step in order to somehow make possible, at least, make possible to activate IHL in a different way. So for a very long time, there has been a kind of unfruitful debate where some would try to demonstrate that the norms were clear and straightforward and only knew one interpretation that forbid the way in which drones were used or AI-enabled defense systems were used. And I understand the point for efficiency and advocacy purposes, but showing how certain interpretation of the norms lead to the stabilization of certain practices is also a way in which another interpretation of the norms can be promoted. And this is something that PAX and that Wim has done in various settings quite well, arguing in favor of certain more restrictive interpretation of norms. So I do still think that there is a potential. It would be extremely disrespectful towards the work that has been done in very powerful ways by people like Wim and his colleagues to say that there is no power possible in the legal discourse. And I do genuinely think that it does hold certain power as long as it's understood as a struggle. And this struggle, I think, is successfully fought when telling stories of the lived experiences of how bodies, behaviors, societies are manufactured by the way in which these technologies and the law, when pushed, when used as part of the stabilizing function, leads to. So it's not, of course, the end of the story. I think our artistic and artivists movements are also quite powerful in making visible these lived experiences. The work of forensic architecture is also one that I think promotes a different type of legal medium or legal fora that is also made powerful through visual evidence that is produced in this kind of settings. But yeah, my conclusion is not that there is nothing to be found in the law to counter the practices that we've discussed.
Rebecca, and should we have a final question? Just a moment. Okay.
This is kind of a follow-up on both of your answers, actually, as well as both of your presentations. But I was kind of curious as how would you be able to sort of navigate the ethics of drone warfare when it comes to the fact that many non-combat groups, sorry, not combat, but I mean unstructured, sort of unorganized, I would say militants, terrorist groups, and so on. They have been using guerrilla warfare, blending in with civilians, especially in densely populated areas. And as you know, drones, whether AI powered or not, those are machines in the end. And these machines, they can't tell who's a good guy or a bad guy, because in the end, all humans have the same blood, breathe the same air, and all that. So how are we able to navigate this and find a way to target without risking collateral warfare when you can't really tell who's friend and who's foe?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand the question. How armed groups can ethically navigate the use of drones? Yeah. I think it's not a matter of ethics, but a matter of legality. Like you look at to what extent people are an imminent threat, and then what kind of options you have to, first of all, I think to arrest people, particularly in a law enforcement operation. And that's a lot of the use of armed drones technically would be in law enforcement operation, because there's like for example, look at the examples I gave already. There are numerous examples where also even actually on the case of Iraq, and we're seeing some kind of change in, for example, how Turkey's operating, because there were civilian casualties in some of these strikes, and now they take out more military operations or policing operations when they try to arrest PKK suspects instead of targeting them because of the pushback from Iraq after civilian casualties. So I think that's a sort of positive development. But that's the obligation you have as a state, like to first of all apprehend people in law enforcement operations and only use lethal force as a last resort. And then also, if you use it, not to, of course, create that it results in civilian casualties. And in that sense, that's sort of the you would expect sort of technically that drones facilitate the ability to distinguish between civilians and provide you a good opportunity to suppose it is like, let's take the example, there is a last resort where you don't have any other option than to use lethal force to stop a terrorist suspect. Then you would expect that with drones that they're able, because of their loitering capabilities and their precision, etc., to do this. But we saw, for example, the case in Afghanistan, where in the strike in Kabul, where even then, like the US with all its might and technology still had like faulty intelligence and killed a whole family, thinking it was a terrorist on its way to the airport with a bomb. So I think we have to sort of like, I think the problem in the end is like it's data, it's interpretation of data that's being picked up, it's interpretation of intelligence. And that's where, in the end, that's a human decision of this kind of interpretation of data, and that's where the biggest risks are. So I think in terms of ethics, yeah, I think some kind of I don't have like a direct answer on how to ethically do that best, but I think it does show like there is a need for second opinions, prevent any sort of how to say that, sort of single-minded focus. Like you see what you want to see. I think it's old adagium from if you how does it go again? It's sorry. Also that it's all the adagium. I can't find the. It's the Thomas theorem. If you define a situation as real, it's real and there are consequences. So if you just think what you're looking at is a threat, you will act that as a threat. And I think the concept from what we saw in Afghanistan was that, and that's like the bias that indeed we have. And that's sort of how, and I don't have an answer to that question, but like I think technology, we have to be careful with automatically accepting every data we get in as true. And yeah, we need to find some kind of solutions to prevent those kind of biases to be part of the decision making, because that could lead to kind of faulty decisions.
Thank you very much, Wim and Rebecca. I would like now to invite you all to join me in warmly thanking our speakers. Thank you very much for their great presentations. Of course, many thanks to you for being here with us, either in person or online. My sincere thanks also go to the ASER team that helped immensely in bringing this event to fruition. And of course, I would like to thank Jasper, Alexandra, Alitia, Leonardo, and of course, Phoebe, who helped us very much today. James as well, my co-coordinator. On a final note, our next HILAC lecture will take place on Thursday, 18th of January on hate speech and incitement. So please stay tuned, you will receive the info. Thank you so much for being here, and I warmly wish you a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stavros. Thanks also to James for having me. Take care. Bye-bye.